The wind hit the mountain pass so hard that Alara had to grip the edge of her cart just to keep her balance. Snow was falling sideways, and the last light of the day was fading fast behind the peaks. She had one more hour of daylight, maybe less, and she was still an hour from home. Her hands were raw from the cold, and the thin wool coat she wore did nothing against a storm like this. She had left the village that morning to sell her stitched blankets at a small trading post near the forest edge, and now she was paying for staying too long. She saw it before she understood what it was. A dark shape, half buried in a snowdrift beside the old stone bridge, moving faintly with the wind. At first she thought it was an animal that had died in the storm, and her chest tightened with pity. She stepped closer, pulling her scarf over her nose, and realized it was fabric, fur. A cloak, enormous and heavy, tangled in the frozen branches of a fallen tree. She should have left it. Every instinct told her that something this fine did not belong lying abandoned in the snow near the territory line of the northern packs. Everyone in her village knew the old warnings. Do not take what belongs to the wolves. Do not touch what smells of them. But the cold was cutting through her like a blade, and the fabric looked warm enough to save her life on the walk home, and so she picked it up. The moment the cloak touched her shoulders, something strange happened. The wind seemed to soften around her, as if the fur itself was pushing the storm back. She told herself it was only her imagination, that any thick cloak would feel this way after an hour in the cold. She pulled the hood over her head and kept walking, faster now, her cart rattling behind her over the icy road. By the time she reached her small house at the edge of the village, her fingers had stopped shaking. She hung the cloak by the door, meaning to return it the next day to whoever might have lost it, but the storm did not break by morning. It did not break for 3 more days, and by the third day, with her own coat threadbare and her firewood running low, she found herself wearing the strange fur cloak again, this time into the village market, because it was the only thing that kept the cold from reaching her bones. The market was small, just a row of wooden stalls selling bread, salted fish, and second-hand tools, but it was crowded that morning because the storm had finally passed and everyone needed supplies. Alara moved between the stalls with her basket, trading 2 of her blankets for a sack of flour and a jar of honey. She noticed people glancing at her, not the usual glances she was used to, the ones that dismissed a seamstress with patched sleeves and calloused hands. These were longer looks, uneasy ones. An old woman selling onions stared at the cloak on her shoulders and quickly looked away, making a small sign with her fingers that Alara did not recognize. She told herself it was nothing. Perhaps the color was unusual for the region. Perhaps people simply were not used to seeing fur so fine on someone dressed as plainly as she was. She kept walking, kept trading, and tried to ignore the way conversations seemed to quiet whenever she passed. Far to the north, in a stone hall built into the side of a mountain, a man woke on the cold floor of his own chamber, with his heart pounding, and his skin covered in a fine layer of frost that should not have been there. Roran opened his eyes slowly, aware before he even moved that something was deeply wrong. He was a king, the alpha of every pack between the northern ridge and the frozen coast, and he had not felt this disoriented since he was a boy first learning to control the change between man and wolf. He sat up and immediately understood 2 things. First, that he had shifted back to human form sometime in the night without meaning to, which had not happened involuntarily since he was 15 years old. Second, that his cloak was gone, not misplaced, not stolen by careless hands. Gone in a way that made the empty space beside his bed feel like a wound. The cloak was not simply a piece of clothing. It had been made generations ago, stitched with old magic passed down through his bloodline, worn by every alpha before him back to the first king of the northern packs. It was the one object that kept his senses sharp, his control steady, and his bond to his own pack strong even when he was far from home. Without it, he felt as though someone had pulled cotton over his ears and wrapped his hands in cloth. The world felt distant, muted, wrong. He called for his advisor, a steady, quiet man named Edwin, who had served the royal hall since Roran's father ruled it. Edwin arrived within minutes, took one look at the king's pale face and the empty hook by the door, and understood immediately that something had gone badly wrong. They searched the hall first, then the grounds, then the nearby forest, where Roran had last worn the cloak 3 nights earlier, during a routine patrol along the border. They found torn branches near the old stone bridge, footprints half filled with new snow, and drag marks that suggested the cloak had been caught and pulled loose during the worst of the storm. But there was no trace of who might have taken it, and worse, there was no trace of where it had gone. By the second day, Roran noticed something even stranger. Deep beneath the fog in his mind, there was a thread. Faint, thin as a single strand of thread pulled from a much larger cloth, but unmistakably there. It felt like his own scent, moving somewhere far to the south, carried by someone whose heartbeat he could almost hear, if he concentrated hard enough. It should not have been possible. The cloak's magic was bound to his blood alone. No one else should have been able to wear it, and still carry a trace of him wherever they went. Unless the cloak had chosen someone. Every child in the northern packs grew up hearing the old stories about bonded cloaks, garments so old and so soaked in generations of pack magic that they sometimes reached out on their own, choosing a person the way a compass needle finds north, without any regard for royal bloodlines or ancient rules. The stories always ended the same way. The alpha who lost such a cloak either reclaimed it swiftly, or watched his entire bloodline's power slowly bleed away into a stranger who did not even know what they carried. Roran did not believe in old stories. He was a practical man, trained since childhood to lead with logic rather than legend. But the thread in his mind grew stronger every hour, pulling him south with a persistence that felt too much like instinct to ignore, and instinct, for a wolf, was rarely wrong. He told Edwin he would go alone. Edwin argued against it immediately, reminding him that an alpha king did not simply walk unguarded into unfamiliar territory chasing a feeling. But Roran had already made up his mind. If the thread was real, if his own scent truly was moving through the world without him, then he needed to see for himself before word spread to the pack elders and turned a lost cloak into a political disaster. He dressed as a traveler, wrapping himself in a plain gray coat that gave no hint of who he was, and set out before dawn with only a small pack of supplies, and the pull of that invisible thread guiding his steps. Back in the village, Ilara had no idea that any of this was happening. She spent her days as she always did, mending torn clothes for neighbors, trading blankets at market, and trying to save enough coin to fix the leaking roof of her small house before the next storm arrived. The fur cloak had become part of her routine now, hung by the door each night and worn each morning when the cold demanded it. She had asked around the village whether anyone had lost such a fine piece of clothing, but no one claimed it, and after a week, she stopped asking. It seemed foolish to freeze out of politeness when whoever had lost it clearly was not looking very hard to find it. What she did notice, though she could not explain it, was that she felt different while wearing it. Calmer, steadier, as though some quiet strength had settled into her shoulders that had not been there before. She told herself it was simply the comfort of finally being warm after years of thin coats and cold winters. She had no reason to think it was anything more. She also noticed, though she pushed the thought away each time it surfaced, that animals behaved strangely around her now. The village dogs that used to bark at strangers went quiet and watchful when she passed, tails low, eyes following her, with an attention that felt almost respectful. A fox she startled while gathering firewood did not run. It simply looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding something, before slipping away into the trees. She told herself these were small things, coincidences. She had a life to manage and a roof that needed fixing, and she did not have time to wonder about foxes and dogs and a cloak that had kept her warmer than any coat had a right to. On the 9th day since she had found it, a stranger arrived in the village. He came on foot, wrapped in a plain gray coat, asking quiet questions at the trading post about a lost item. He did not shout or demand attention. He simply moved from stall to stall, speaking low, watching everyone who passed with the sharp, careful attention of a man who had trained himself never to miss a detail. Several people noticed him, because strangers were rare in a village this small, tucked so close to the mountains that few travelers bothered to pass through, unless they had lost their way. Ilara did not see him arrive. She was at home that morning, mending a torn sleeve for a neighbor's son, the fur cloak hanging by the door where it always did after her morning trip for water. She had no way of knowing that somewhere across the village, a king in disguise was following an invisible thread that grew stronger with every step, and that the thread was pointing, with absolute certainty, directly at her door. The days that followed would change everything Ilara believed about her simple, quiet life. But on that particular morning, she still believed the biggest problem she faced was a leaking roof and a torn sleeve that needed careful stitching. She threaded her needle, unaware that somewhere close by, the true owner of her warmest possession was closing the distance between them with every breath, and that once he found her, neither of their lives would ever return to what they had been before. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the temperature fell sharply, Ilara wrapped the cloak around her shoulders once more, to walk to the well before dark. She did not know that a pair of sharp eyes had already spotted her from across the square, or that the stranger in the gray coat had gone very still the moment he saw her, his breath catching, as the thread in his mind pulled taut, unmistakable now, impossible to deny. He knew, without a single doubt, that the woman crossing the square in the fading light was wearing his cloak, and that somehow, against every law of his world, it had chosen her instead of him. Ilara set her water jug down at the edge of the well and pulled the cloak tighter as the wind picked up. She had felt someone watching her since she left her house, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck that she could not explain, but every time she turned to look, the square appeared empty except for the last few villagers hurrying home before dark. She told herself it was nerves, or perhaps only the cold making her jumpy, and she reached for the well rope to draw water. A voice spoke behind her, calm and low. "Excuse me, that cloak you are wearing, would you mind telling me where you found it?" She turned quickly, startled, and found herself facing the stranger she had noticed at the edge of the square earlier that day, though she had not paid him much attention then. He was tall, with dark hair damp from the evening mist, and eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her grip the well rope a little tighter. He did not look threatening exactly, but there was something coiled and careful about him, like a man used to controlling every movement he made. "I found it," she said carefully, "near the old bridge after the storm. Why do you ask?" He did not answer right away. His gaze moved from her face down to the fur at her shoulders, and something flickered across his expression that she could not read. Grief, maybe, or disbelief. "It is a fine piece of work," he said finally. "I have not seen craftsmanship like that in a long time. I only wondered." Ilara studied him for a moment, unconvinced by the casual tone he was using. Something about the way he held himself, straight-backed and alert even while trying to appear relaxed, told her this was not idle curiosity. "If you know who it belongs to," she said, "I would be glad to return it. I have asked around the village and no one has claimed it." Something shifted in his face at that, quick and sharp, though he covered it almost immediately. "That is very honest of you," he said. "Most people would simply keep something so valuable. Most people have not had to sleep under 3 blankets during a storm because their coat was not warm enough," she answered, more bluntly than she intended. "If someone wants it back badly enough to ask a stranger questions in the dark, they are welcome to prove it belongs to them." He almost smiled at that, an expression that softened his face for just a moment before the careful mask returned. "Fair enough," he said. "My name is Roran. I am traveling through, looking for something that was taken from me during the storm. I believe it might be that cloak." Ilara narrowed her eyes. "If it is yours, tell me something about it that only the owner would know." It was a reasonable request, and Roran understood immediately that he could not answer it without revealing far more than he wanted to reveal, to a stranger, in the middle of a village square. The cloak carried old magic that responded to blood and bond rather than ordinary details like stitching patterns or the color of the lining. He could describe the weave, the clasp at the collar shaped like a wolf's head, the deep gray fur that shifted color slightly in different light, but any thief clever enough to steal something this valuable might know those same details. "There is a clasp at the collar," he said slowly, "shaped like a wolf. And if you look closely at the inner lining, there is stitching along the seam that forms a pattern like claw marks, old and faded, sewn there generations ago." Ilara's breath caught slightly. She had noticed both of those details herself in the days since she found it. The wolf-shaped clasp she assumed was simply decorative, and the strange stitching inside that she had thought was only wear from age. Hearing a stranger describe them so precisely, without hesitation, sent a small chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold evening air. "That does not prove you are the owner," she said carefully, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "It only proves you have seen it before." "I understand your caution," Roran said, "but I promise you, I mean you no harm. I only need to understand how it came to be so far from where I lost it, and why." Before she could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them. A young boy from the village, one of Alara's neighbors, came running across the square calling her name, out of breath and clearly upset. "Alara, come quick," he gasped. "Something is wrong with the animals at the edge of town. All the dogs are gathered by the tree line, howling, and nobody can get them to stop." Alara glanced at Roran, uncertain, then back at the boy. "Howling? Since when?" "Since just now," the boy said. "Since you walked into the square." A cold understanding passed between Alara and Roran in that moment, though neither of them said it aloud. Roran's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly toward the tree line, where distant howls now carried faintly on the wind, a sound that raised the hair on Alara's arms, even though she did not fully understand why it frightened her. "I think," Roran said quietly, "that we should speak somewhere more private. There are things about that cloak you deserve to know, and this is not the place to explain them." Alara hesitated, torn between the instinct to run home and lock her door, and a growing, uncomfortable curiosity about what exactly she had been wearing for the past 9 days. The howling in the distance did not stop, and somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear, she felt something else stirring, a pull, faint but unmistakable, toward the man standing in front of her, as though some part of her recognized him, even though they had never met before that evening. Against every instinct telling her to be careful, she nodded slowly. "Fine," she said, "but we talk here, in the open, where people can see us. I do not know you, and I am not about to walk off into the dark with a stranger who appeared the same day my dogs decided to lose their minds." "That is fair," Roran said, and for the first time since he had spoken to her, something like relief crossed his face, as though her sharp caution reassured him more than it worried him. He glanced once more toward the tree line, where the howling had begun to fade, then back at her, his expression settling into something steadier, something that looked almost like the beginning of trust. "Then let me start," he said quietly, "by telling you exactly what that cloak is, and why every wolf within 20 miles just felt you standing in this square." Roran led her to a bench near the edge of the square, close enough to the lantern light spilling from the trading post that Alara could see his face clearly, and far enough from listening ears that he could speak freely. She sat with the water jug still at her feet, forgotten, her arms wrapped around herself as much from nerves as from cold. "I am not simply a traveler," he began. "I lead the northern packs, the wolves who live in the mountains beyond the ridge. That cloak you found was mine, worn by my family for many generations. It is not ordinary fur. It carries old magic, tied to blood and to bond, and it does not simply fall from someone's shoulders by accident, no matter how fierce the storm." Alara stared at him, waiting for some sign that he was joking, some crack in his expression that would tell her this was an elaborate trick. She found none. His voice was steady, his eyes serious, and there was a quiet weight to the way he spoke that made her stomach tighten with unease. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that you are some kind of wolf, like the old stories." "Not some kind," he said. "I am the alpha king of the northern packs. I shift between man and wolf, as every member of my bloodline has for hundreds of years. The cloak you are wearing helps me control that shift, and keeps my senses sharp even far from my own territory. 3 nights before you found it, I lost it during a patrol near that same bridge, and since then, I have felt a strange pull, as though a piece of myself was moving somewhere far to the south." Ilara's mind raced, trying to fit his words into some rational explanation, but the howling from the tree line, the strange calm the cloak gave her, the way animals had begun watching her differently, all of it clicked together with an uncomfortable, undeniable logic. "Why would it choose me?" she asked quietly. "I am nobody. I am a seamstress. I have never even left this village." "That is what troubles me," Roran admitted. "Cloaks like this are supposed to remain bound only to the bloodline that made them. For it to reach toward someone outside that bloodline, someone it was never meant to bond with, means something about you may be different than you realize, or that the magic itself is far older and stranger than even I understood." Alara pulled the cloak tighter around herself without meaning to, an instinctive gesture that did not go unnoticed by Roran, whose eyes softened slightly at the sight. "I only want my life back the way it was," she said. "I do not want to be part of wolf magic or pack politics or anything like it. I want my roof fixed and my garden planted come spring, that is all. I understand, Roran said gently, and I am not here to take your life from you. I only need to understand what has happened, for both our sakes. If word spreads among my pack that the royal cloak has bonded to someone outside the bloodline, there will be those who see it as a threat, or as an opportunity to challenge my position. I would rather understand the truth before that happens, quietly, and decide together what should be done. Together, Ilara repeated, an edge of disbelief in her voice. I met you an hour ago. An hour ago you also did not know wolves existed beyond the old stories your grandmother told you as a child, Roran said, and there was the faintest hint of dry humor in his voice now, enough to ease some of the tension between them. I am not asking you to trust me completely. I am only asking for time to figure this out before either of us does something we cannot undo. The distant howling had stopped entirely now, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the village settling in for the night, doors closing, voices calling children inside, the creak of wooden shutters against the wind. Ilara looked down at the fur cloak on her shoulders, seeing it now not as a simple gift from a lucky storm, but as something far heavier than its actual weight. If I give it back to you right now, she said slowly, would everything go back to normal? Would the pull you feel disappear? Roran considered the question carefully before answering, because he sensed that his answer mattered more than either of them yet understood. I do not know, he admitted honestly. I have never heard of a cloak choosing someone outside the bloodline before. It is possible that simply returning it would end things cleanly. It is also possible that once a bond like this begins, it cannot be undone so easily, no matter who is wearing the fur. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening wind. Then what do we do? She asked. Roran held her gaze, and for the first time since their conversation began, something passed between them that neither one could name. Not fear exactly, and not simple curiosity, but something quieter and more complicated, the beginning of a thread neither of them had asked for, tightening slowly around two lives that had, until 9 days ago, existed in entirely separate worlds. We find out together, he said. Starting tomorrow, if you will allow it. I would like to see where you found the cloak, and I would like your permission to stay nearby for a few days, so that whatever this bond turns out to be, we understand it before it grows into something neither of us can control. Ilara looked at him for a long moment, weighing the strangeness of everything he had told her against the quiet steadiness in his voice, and against the small, undeniable truth that some part of her, ever since she first wrapped the cloak around her shoulders in the snow, had been waiting for exactly this conversation without knowing it. Fine, she said finally, standing and picking up her water jug. But you sleep at the inn, not anywhere near my house, and you answer every question I ask honestly, even the ones you do not want to answer. Agreed, Roran said, and as she turned to walk home through the darkening square, he remained on the bench a moment longer, watching her go, the thread in his mind no longer just a pull toward an object, but something warmer, more complicated, and far more dangerous to his careful, controlled life than any lost cloak had ever been. Morning came gray and quiet, with a thin mist hanging low over the rooftops of the village. Ilara had barely slept, her mind turning over everything Roran had told her, testing the story against every ounce of common sense she had, and finding, uncomfortably, that it held together far better than she wanted it to. She dressed carefully, left the cloak hanging by the door out of some instinct she did not examine too closely, and walked to the inn, where she had agreed to meet him. Roran was already waiting outside, dressed once more in his plain gray coat, looking as though he had not slept much better than she had. He straightened when he saw her approaching, his eyes flicking immediately to her shoulders, and something in his expression eased slightly when he saw she was not wearing the cloak. You left it at home, he said. I thought it might be easier to talk without it watching us, she said dryly, and he almost smiled at that, the tension between them loosening just slightly in the cool morning air. They walked together toward the old stone bridge at the edge of the village, the same path Ilara had taken during the storm 9 days earlier. She described the moment she found the cloak, the way it had seemed to still the wind around her, the strange sense of calm it gave her from the very first moment she put it on. Roran listened carefully, asking quiet questions, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When they reached the bridge, Roran crouched beside the fallen tree where the cloak had been tangled, running his fingers over the broken branches, his jaw tight with concentration. Alara watched him, noticing the careful, controlled way he moved, like a man used to reading signs in the world that most people never noticed. The wind that night was strong enough to tear the cloak loose from the fastenings, he said finally, standing and brushing snow from his knees. But it should not have carried this far from where I fell. Something guided it here, to this exact spot, where you would find it. Guided it, Alara repeated. You think the cloak chose to come here? I think, Roran said slowly, that the magic in it was already searching for someone before it ever left my shoulders. Perhaps it had been searching for a long time, and the storm simply gave it the chance it needed. Alara felt an uncomfortable shiver at that idea, the thought that some ancient magic had been quietly waiting, patient as stone, for a moment to reach into her ordinary life and pull her into something far larger than she had ever imagined for herself. Why me? She asked again, quieter this time. There has to be a reason. Magic like that does not choose people at random, does it? I do not know the answer yet, Roran admitted, but I intend to find out, carefully, and without causing you harm in the process. They spent the rest of the morning walking the length of the forest edge, Roran occasionally pausing to study tracks in the snow, or sense something on the wind that Alara could not detect at all. She found herself watching him more than she meant to, noticing the quiet confidence in the way he moved, the careful patience he showed even when his questions clearly frustrated him with the lack of answers. It was strange, she thought, how quickly the fear from the night before had settled into something closer to curiosity, even trust, though she was careful not to examine that feeling too closely. As the sun rose higher and the mist began to clear, Roran suddenly stopped walking, his entire body going still, in a way that immediately put Alara on alert. What is it? She asked quietly. We are being watched, he said, his voice low and controlled. Someone followed us from the village. Alara's heart began to race, and she scanned the tree line, seeing nothing but snow-covered branches and pale morning light. How do you know? She whispered. I can smell them, Roran said simply. Stay close to me, and do not run. Running will only make things worse. Before Alara could ask what he meant, a figure stepped out from behind a cluster of trees further down the path, a woman with sharp features and cold eyes, dressed in dark traveling clothes that marked her as someone who had journeyed far to reach this quiet village. She studied Roran with open recognition, and something like satisfaction crossed her face when her gaze shifted to Alara. So the rumors were true, the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow. The great Alpha King, chasing his own scent across half the country, only to find it wrapped around some village girl who has no idea what she carries. Roran's expression hardened instantly, his casual traveler's posture replaced by something sharper, more commanding, that Alara had not seen from him before. Mara, he said, his voice cold. This does not concern the southern packs. Return home before I make you regret staying. The woman named Mara laughed softly, though there was no warmth in the sound at all. Everything that happens to the northern bloodline concerns the southern packs, she said, especially when the royal cloak abandons its own king for a stranger with no pack, no bond, and no claim to any of this. Do you have any idea what this means for the balance between our territories, Roran? Do you have any idea how many packs will move the moment they learn your bloodline's power has slipped from your grasp? Alara stood frozen beside Roran, understanding now that whatever quiet, careful investigation he had hoped to conduct had just become something far more dangerous, something with consequences reaching well beyond one lost cloak and one confused seamstress in a small mountain village. Nothing has slipped, Roran said sharply. The cloak remains within my control. I am simply investigating an unusual occurrence. Mara's eyes moved to Alara again, studying her with an intensity that made Alara's skin crawl. An unusual occurrence, she repeated softly. That is one way to describe it. I have another word for it, opportunity. And I intend to make full use of it before you find a way to fix your little mistake, Alpha King. Without another word, Mara turned and disappeared back into the trees, leaving a heavy silence behind her that neither Roran nor Alara broke for several long moments. Finally, Alara turned to him, her voice shaking slightly despite her effort to keep it steady. Who was that? She asked, and what did she mean by opportunity? Roran's jaw was tight, his eyes still fixed on the trees where Mara had vanished. That, he said grimly, was the beginning of exactly the problem I was hoping to avoid. Word has already spread beyond the northern packs, and if the southern packs know, they will not be the only ones coming to see for themselves whether the rumors are true. Ilara felt the ground shift beneath her, the quiet, ordinary life she had known just 10 days earlier now feeling impossibly far away, replaced by a world of ancient magic and rival packs and dangerous strangers who saw her not as a person, but as an opportunity to be seized. She looked at Roran, searching his face for reassurance, and found instead a grim determination that told her this was only the beginning of something far larger than either of them had been prepared for. "We need to move quickly," Roran said finally, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "Before more of them arrive, I need to understand exactly what kind of bond has formed between you and that cloak, and whether there is any way to protect you from what is coming." "And if there is not?" Ilara asked quietly. Roran met her eyes, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something like fear flicker behind his carefully controlled expression. "Then," he said slowly, "we will need to find another way to keep you safe, because I promise you, Ilara, I will not let anyone use you as a weapon in pack politics you never asked to be part of." They returned to the village in tense silence, both of them alert to every sound in the forest, every shift of wind that might carry another stranger's scent. Roran kept close to Ilara the entire way, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, and she found herself grateful for his presence, even as her mind reeled from everything Mara had said. Back at the edge of the village, Roran finally spoke again, his voice low, so that no passing villager might overhear. "I need to send word to Edwin, my advisor," he said. "He needs to know that Mara has already found us, and I need his counsel on how to proceed without causing a war between the packs." "A war," Ilara repeated, her stomach tightening. "You said this was pack politics. You did not say anything about a war." "I did not want to frighten you before it was necessary," Roran admitted, "but you deserve the truth now. The northern and southern packs have kept an uneasy peace for many years, built on the understanding that each alpha's bloodline remains strong and unchallenged. If the southern packs believe my bloodline's power has weakened enough to let the royal cloak slip away to an outsider, some among them will see it as the perfect moment to challenge my authority, or worse, to seize northern territory, while they believe me distracted and vulnerable." Ilara absorbed this, feeling the weight of it settle over her like a physical thing. "And I am at the center of it," she said quietly, "because of a cloak I found in the snow." "I am at the center of it," Roran corrected gently. "You are simply someone I am now responsible for protecting, whether either of us wanted that responsibility or not. I will not let what happened to you become the excuse for a conflict that has nothing to do with you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the quiet conviction in his voice, but the fear that had settled into her chest since Mara's appearance in the forest was not so easily soothed by words alone. "What do we do now?" she asked. "For now," Roran said, "we act as though nothing has changed. You continue your ordinary life, and I remain nearby, watching for any further signs of southern packs in the area. I will write to Edwin tonight and ask him to quietly gather information about how far the rumors have spread, and whether there is any way to resolve this before it grows worse." Ilara nodded slowly, though the idea of continuing her ordinary life felt almost laughable now, knowing what she knew. She returned home that afternoon, mended 2 more torn garments for waiting customers, and tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of her work, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching the tree line, waiting for another stranger to appear. That evening, as she prepared a simple meal of bread and dried vegetables, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it cautiously, relieved to find Roran standing there, his expression grim but controlled. "I have received word back from Edwin already," he said, stepping inside at her gesture. He sent it by messenger hawk, which means the situation is urgent enough that he did not want to wait for a letter carried by hand. "What does it say?" Ilara asked, closing the door behind him. Roran unfolded the small parchment carefully. "Edwin writes that word of the bonded cloak has already reached 3 separate packs beyond our northern territory," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "He believes it spread faster than expected, because Mara herself carried the news south immediately after leaving us in the forest this morning. He also writes that at least one of those packs, the Eastern Coalition led by a man named Callum, has already begun moving scouts toward our border, testing whether my absence from the northern hall has left any weakness they can exploit. Ilara felt her chest tighten with dread. This is happening so fast, she said. It has only been a day. News travels quickly among wolves, Roran said grimly. Scent and instinct carry information faster than any human messenger ever could. By tomorrow, it is likely that every major pack within 100 miles will know that the royal cloak has bonded to someone outside my bloodline, and every ambitious rival will be calculating how best to use that information for their own advantage. Ilara sat down heavily at her small wooden table, her mind racing. What happens if they come here? She asked quietly. To the village, to me. Roran's expression hardened, and he sat across from her, his eyes steady and serious. That will not happen, he said firmly. I will not allow any pack to threaten this village or anyone in it. But I will not lie to you and pretend there is no danger. Some among the rival packs may see capturing you, or forcing some kind of claim over you, as a way to weaken my bloodline permanently. I need you to understand that risk clearly, because from this point forward, every decision we make needs to account for it. Ilara looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of exaggeration, and finding none. What would you have me do? She asked finally. Roran was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his next words carefully. There is a way to protect you more fully, he said slowly. If the bond between you and the cloak is confirmed as something more than an accident of a lost storm, if it truly represents what the old stories describe as a chosen mate bond, then formally acknowledging it would place you under the full protection of the Northern Pack, with all the authority and power that comes with standing beside an alpha king. No rival pack would dare move against someone who holds that position, not without risking outright war with every wolf under my command. Ilara's breath caught. You are talking about marriage, she said slowly. To a king. A man I met yesterday. I am talking about survival, Roran said quietly, though something in his voice suggested the two ideas were not as separate to him as he wanted them to sound. I am not asking you to decide anything tonight. I am simply telling you that the option exists, and that if the danger grows as quickly as I fear it will, it may become the only option that keeps you safe. Ilara sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the small fire crackling in her hearth, trying to comprehend how her life had transformed so completely in the span of 2 days. 10 days ago, her greatest worry had been a leaking roof and a torn sleeve. Now she was being asked to consider marrying a king, to avoid becoming a target in a war between wolves. I need time to think, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Roran nodded immediately, respect clear in his expression. Take whatever time you need, he said. I will not push you toward a decision you are not ready to make. But please, Ilara, do not go anywhere alone until we understand more clearly what we are facing. I could not bear it if something happened to you because I failed to protect you properly. Something in the way he said her name, quiet and earnest, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, despite the fear still coiled tight in her stomach. She nodded slowly, and as Roran rose to leave, promising to return at first light, she found herself watching him go with a complicated tangle of emotions she was not yet ready to untangle, caught somewhere between fear for what was coming and a growing, undeniable pull toward the man who had walked into her ordinary life and turned it upside down in less than 2 days. 3 days passed with no further sign of Mara or any other stranger, and Ilara allowed herself to hope, cautiously, that the danger had passed as quickly as it arrived. Roran remained close, staying at the village inn and checking on her twice each day, though he was careful never to overstep the boundaries she had set on that first tense evening. Slowly, despite everything, a fragile kind of routine began to form between them, one that felt less like the tense alliance of strangers and more like something gentler, though neither of them named it aloud. On the 4th morning, Ilara woke to the sound of raised voices outside her window. She rose quickly, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside to find a small crowd gathered near the village square, murmuring anxiously among themselves. She spotted Roran already there, his face tight with concern, speaking quietly with the village elder, a stooped gray-haired man named Nathaniel, who had led the small community for as long as Ilara could remember. What is happening? She asked, hurrying to join them. Nathaniel turned to her, his weathered face grave. Travelers arrived at dawn, he said. They claim to be merchants passing through, but they have been asking very specific questions about you, Ilara. Where you live, what you do, Whether you have any family who might come looking for you if you were to disappear for a time." Ilara's blood ran cold. Roran stepped closer to her immediately, his posture shifting into something protective and alert. "How many?" he asked Nathaniel sharply. "4 that we have seen," Nathaniel said, "though there may be more waiting outside the village." Roran's jaw tightened, and he turned to Ilara, his voice low and urgent. "This is what I feared," he said. "They are testing whether they can take you quietly, without open conflict, before anyone realizes what is happening." Ilara felt panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, remembering the calm steadiness the cloak had given her in the snow, trying to summon some of that same strength now. "What do we do?" she asked. "We cannot stay here," Roran said. "If they are bold enough to send scouts asking questions in the open, they believe they have enough numbers to act soon. I need to get you somewhere safer, somewhere with proper defenses, until this is resolved." "Where?" Ilara asked. "My hall, in the northern mountains," Roran said. "It is a full day's journey from here, but it is protected by my entire pack, and no rival coalition would dare attack it directly, without starting a war. None of them are prepared to win." Ilara hesitated. The idea of leaving her home, her small familiar life, everything she had ever known, filling her with a fear that rivaled even the danger from the strangers in the square. But looking at the tense, worried faces of her neighbors, people she had known her whole life, she understood with sudden clarity that staying might put all of them at risk, not just herself. "If I leave," she said slowly, "will the danger to this village disappear with me?" "It should," Roran said. "Their interest lies entirely with you and the cloak. Once you are beyond their reach and under my full protection, there will be no reason for them to trouble this village any further." Ilara looked around at the worried faces of the people who had known her all her life, people who had never asked to be caught in the middle of wolfpack politics, and made her decision quickly, before fear could talk her out of it. "Then I will go," she said, "today, if that is what is needed to keep everyone here safe." Roran's relief was visible, though he tried to mask it with his usual careful composure. "We leave within the hour," he said. "Gather only what you truly need. I will arrange for a message to reach Edwin so that riders can meet us partway and escort us the rest of the distance safely." Ilara hurried home, her hands shaking slightly as she packed a small bag with essential clothing, a few precious tools from her sewing kit, and the small collection of coins she had saved over the years. Her eyes fell on the fur cloak hanging by the door, and she paused, staring at it for a long moment before finally lifting it and settling it over her shoulders once more, feeling the same strange calm settle over her that she had felt from the very first day. Whatever this bond was, whatever strange magic had drawn Roran across half the country to find her, she understood now that there was no undoing it, no returning to the simple, uncomplicated life she had known before the storm. The only path forward was through whatever waited for her in the northern mountains, and she intended to face it with as much courage as she could summon. When she stepped outside, Roran was waiting with 2 horses borrowed from the village stable, his expression tense but resolute. He helped her mount, his hands steady despite the urgency of their departure, and as they rode out of the village toward the mountain pass, Ilara looked back once at the small house that had been her entire world for so many years, wondering if she would ever return to the quiet, ordinary life she had left behind. They rode hard through the morning, Roran setting a punishing pace that left little room for conversation, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of pursuit. By midday, they had covered more distance than Ilara had traveled in years, and her body ached from the unfamiliar strain of hard riding, but she pushed through the discomfort, understanding the urgency behind Roran's silence. It was as the sun began its slow descent toward late afternoon that Roran suddenly reined in his horse, his entire body going rigid with alert tension. Ilara stopped beside him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," Roran said quietly, his eyes fixed on the tree line ahead, several of them, moving to cut off our path before we reach the mountain pass. Ilara's stomach dropped. "Mara," she breathed. "Perhaps," Roran said grimly, already reaching for the reins to guide his horse off the main path and toward a narrower trail through denser forest. "Or someone working with her. Either way, we cannot risk a direct confrontation with you exposed like this. Follow me closely, and whatever happens, do not fall behind." They pushed their horses into the trees, branches whipping past them as they navigated the narrow, uneven trail, the sound of distant hoofbeats growing steadily louder behind them, despite their best efforts to move quickly and quietly. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, fear and adrenaline mixing together as she clung tightly to her horse, trusting Roran's lead through terrain she had never seen before. "They are gaining," Roran called back to her, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "We need to reach the ridge ahead. There is a narrow crossing there that will slow them down enough for us to gain distance." Alara pushed her horse harder, ignoring the burning in her legs and the fear clawing at her chest, focused entirely on staying close behind Roran as the sound of pursuing riders grew louder still, the northern mountains rising ahead of them like a distant promise of safety that suddenly felt impossibly far away. The narrow ridge crossing appeared ahead just as the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew close enough for Alara to hear the shouts of the riders behind them. Roran guided his horse onto the crossing first, a slim path of packed earth barely wide enough for a single horse, flanked on both sides by steep drops into rocky ravines below. "Follow exactly where I ride," Roran called back, his voice steady despite the danger. "Do not look down, and trust your horse to find its footing." Alara nodded, though he could not see the gesture, her entire focus narrowing to the path ahead and the sound of her own horse's hooves striking the packed earth. Behind her, the pursuing riders had reached the base of the ridge, and she heard a voice, sharp and commanding, calling for them to halt. "There is no reasoning with them," Roran said grimly, glancing back once. "Keep moving. Once we clear the ridge, the path widens into forest again, and we can lose them among the trees." They pushed forward across the narrow crossing, the wind picking up around them as they climbed higher, and Alara felt her heart in her throat with every uneven step her horse took near the ravine's edge. Behind them, she heard the pursuing riders attempting to follow onto the ridge, their voices growing more urgent as they realized the danger of crossing at speed. Halfway across, disaster nearly struck. Alara's horse stumbled on a loose stone, lurching sideways toward the edge of the path, and she cried out, gripping the reins with white-knuckled hands as her heart seized with terror. Roran spun his horse around instantly, closing the distance between them with startling speed, reaching out to steady her mount with a firm hand on the bridle until the horse regained its footing. "Careful," he said, his voice tight with worry, even as he maintained his composure. "We are almost across. Just a little further." They cleared the ridge moments later, emerging onto a wider forest path where the trees grew close and thick, providing exactly the cover Roran had promised. He led them deeper into the woods, taking a winding, deliberately confusing route designed to throw off anyone still attempting to follow, until finally, as the light began to fade toward evening, he slowed their pace and allowed both horses to catch their breath. "I believe we have lost them," he said quietly, though his eyes remained watchful, scanning the darkening forest around them. "But we should not linger here longer than necessary. There is a sheltered clearing not far from here where we can rest briefly, before continuing toward the northern hall under cover of darkness." Alara nodded, her body trembling slightly from the lingering adrenaline of their narrow escape. As they rode the final stretch to the clearing, she found herself glancing over at Roran repeatedly, seeing him now not just as the mysterious stranger who had upended her life, but as someone who had, without hesitation, risked his own safety to steady her horse at the edge of a dangerous ravine. "Thank you," she said quietly, once they had dismounted and settled near a small fire Roran quickly built for warmth. "Back there, on the ridge, you could have kept riding." Roran looked at her, something serious and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "I would never leave you in danger," he said simply. "Whatever else happens between us, whatever this bond turns out to mean, I promise to protect you, and I intend to keep that promise with everything I have." Alara studied his face in the firelight, feeling the strange, complicated warmth that had been building between them since their first tense conversation in the village square. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked quietly. "I understand the politics, the danger to your bloodline, but tonight, back on that ridge, it did not feel like politics. It felt like something else." Roran was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, as though searching for the right words. "It stopped being only about politics somewhere along the way," he admitted finally, his voice low. "I cannot say exactly when it happened. Perhaps it was the moment you refused to simply hand the cloak back without proof of who I was. Or perhaps it was watching you decide, without hesitation, to leave everything you knew behind, to protect people who have known you your whole life. Whatever the reason, I find that my concern for your safety no longer feels like duty alone." Elara felt her breath catch at his words, the honesty in them landing somewhere deep in her chest that she had not expected. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly, surprising herself with the confession. "Since the moment I put that cloak on in the snow, something in me has felt different. Calmer, but also more aware, as though some part of me recognized something before I understood what it was." They sat in silence for a while after that, the fire crackling softly between them, the weight of everything they had survived that day settling slowly into something quieter and more intimate than either of them had expected to find in the middle of a dangerous flight through the forest. Finally, Roran spoke again, his voice careful and measured. "We will reach the northern hall by tomorrow evening," he said. "Once we arrive, you will be safe from any further attempts to reach you. But I must warn you, the pack elders will have many questions, and some among them will not welcome the idea of an outsider bonded to the royal cloak, regardless of how it happened." Elara nodded slowly, understanding that the danger from the forest riders was only the first of many challenges still waiting ahead. "Whatever they say," she said quietly, "I did not ask for any of this, but I am not going to run from it either, not after everything today has shown me." Roran looked at her with something like admiration in his eyes, and for a moment, the fear and exhaustion of the day faded into something quieter and steadier between them, a fragile but growing understanding that whatever challenges awaited them at the Northern Hall, they would face them together, bound by a thread neither of them had chosen, but neither of them wished, any longer, to break. They reached the Northern Hall the following evening, the massive stone structure rising from the mountainside like something carved by giants rather than built by human hands. Elara had never seen anything like it, towering walls of gray stone lit by torches along every wall, and dozens of watchful eyes following their arrival from windows and doorways, as word spread quickly that the king had returned, and that he had not returned alone. Edwin met them at the entrance, his relief at seeing Roran safe, quickly giving way to careful appraisal of Elara standing beside him, the fur cloak still settled over her shoulders. "Welcome to the Northern Hall," he said to her, his tone polite but guarded. "I imagine you have had quite an eventful journey." "That would be one way to describe it," Elara said, and something in her dry response seemed to ease a bit of the tension in Edwin's expression, as though he had expected someone more fragile or overwhelmed by the circumstances. Roran quickly briefed Edwin on the attack near the ridge crossing, his voice tight, with barely contained anger, as he described the pursuing riders. Edwin's face grew grave as he listened. "This confirms what I feared," he said. "The Eastern Coalition is moving more aggressively than we anticipated. We received word this morning that Callum himself has called for a gathering of pack elders within the week, ostensibly to discuss border disputes, but I suspect the true purpose is to publicly challenge your claim to leadership given the unusual circumstances surrounding the cloak." Roran's jaw tightened. "Then we have little time to prepare," he said. "Elara needs proper protection within the hall, and we need to decide how to present this situation to the gathering before Callum has the chance to twist the narrative in his favor." Over the following days, Elara found herself thrust into a world entirely foreign to everything she had known, learning the customs and politics of the Northern Pack under Edwin's patient but thorough instruction, while Roran spent long hours in tense meetings with pack elders who eyed Elara with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion whenever she passed through the hall's corridors. She met Grace, a warm-hearted young woman who served as one of the hall's healers, and quickly became the closest thing to a friend Elara found within those unfamiliar stone walls. Grace explained, gently but honestly, the significance of what had happened between Elara and the cloak, describing old legends of chosen bonds that occurred perhaps once or twice in a generation, always surrounded by controversy, and always testing the strength of whichever alpha experienced them. "It is not unheard of," Grace explained one evening as she helped Elara adjust to the unfamiliar formal clothing expected within the hall. "But it is rare enough that many elders have never witnessed it themselves, and rare things frighten people who value tradition above all else. Some will see you as a threat to the old ways. Others, if you prove yourself capable, may come to see you as exactly what this pack needs." "What do you mean?" Elara asked. Grace smiled knowingly. "Roran has led with strength and discipline since he became alpha," she said. but some among the elders have whispered that he lacks warmth, that his focus on duty above all else has made him distant from the people he leads. A bond like yours, unconventional as it is, shows a different side of him. Some will resent that, others may welcome it more than you expect. The day of the pack gathering arrived faster than Alara felt prepared for. She stood beside Roran in the great hall, dressed in formal northern attire that Grace had helped her choose. The fur cloak settled properly over her shoulders for the first time since their journey, as dozens of pack representatives from across the northern and eastern territories filled the hall, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Callum arrived last, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes, who wasted no time addressing the gathering with barely veiled accusations. "We have all heard the rumors," he began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "that the royal cloak, symbol of the northern bloodline's strength for generations, has abandoned its rightful king for an outsider with no pack, no bloodline, and no claim to power of any kind. I ask you all, what does this say about the strength of northern leadership, if such a fundamental symbol of authority can simply slip away during a single storm?" Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, and Alara felt her pulse quicken, aware of dozens of eyes now fixed on her, weighing and judging her presence in a world she had never asked to enter. She glanced at Roran, seeing the controlled tension in his jaw, and made a decision in that moment that surprised even herself. Before Roran could respond, Alara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coiled tight in her chest. "If I may speak," she said, and the hall fell into surprised silence at the boldness of an outsider addressing the gathering directly. Roran glanced at her, a flicker of concern and admiration crossing his face, but he said nothing, allowing her the space to continue. "I did not ask for this cloak to find me," Alara said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I did not seek out magic, or bonds, or any claim to power. I found a piece of fabric buried in the snow during a storm that nearly killed me, and I wore it because I was cold and desperate, nothing more. Whatever happened between myself and this cloak happened without my knowledge or consent, just as it happened without King Roran's consent either. If this bond reveals anything about northern leadership, it reveals that even ancient magic recognizes something worth protecting when it finds it, rather than simply following bloodlines out of habit alone." The hall remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, the weight of her words settling over the gathered crowd. Callum's expression darkened, clearly unprepared for such a direct and confident response from someone he had expected to remain silent and overwhelmed. "Pretty words," he said finally, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, "but they do not change the fundamental problem. Tradition exists for a reason, and this bond, however it occurred, threatens the very foundation of how our packs determine legitimate leadership." "Then perhaps," Roran said, finally stepping forward to stand beside Alara, his voice carrying clear authority through the hall, "it is time we examined why our traditions fear anything unfamiliar so deeply, rather than assuming unfamiliar automatically means dangerous. I did not choose this bond, Callum, but I have come to understand it as something far more valuable than simple bloodline succession. Alara has shown more courage in the past week than many pack members show in a lifetime, and I will not apologize for a bond that has only strengthened my resolve to lead this pack well." The tension in the hall remained thick, uncertainty hanging over the gathered representatives as they absorbed the unexpected strength of both Roran and Alara's words. But Alara could sense, faintly, that something in the room had shifted, that whatever verdict the pack elders eventually reached, the challenge Callum had hoped to win easily had become far more complicated than he anticipated. The elders retreated to a private chamber to deliberate, leaving Roran, Alara, and the gathered representatives waiting in tense silence within the great hall. Edwin paced nearby, his expression tight with worry, while Grace stayed close to Alara, offering quiet reassurance whenever the waiting grew too heavy to bear. "You spoke well," Grace whispered at one point. "I have never seen anyone address the elders so directly, especially not someone who arrived here only days ago." "I did not plan any of it," Alara admitted quietly. "I only knew I could not stand there silently while Callum spoke about me as though I were some kind of problem to be solved rather than a person." Across the hall, Roran stood in quiet conversation with a few pack members who had approached him cautiously, their expressions curious rather than hostile, and Alara found herself watching him with a growing sense of pride she had not expected to feel toward a man she had known for such a short time. Whatever else happened in the coming hours, she understood now that she did not regret the choice she had made, the words she had spoken, or the strange, unlikely bond that had brought her into this world in the first place. The waiting stretched into the late afternoon, before Edwin finally received word that the elders had reached a decision. The great hall filled once more, the tension so thick that Alara could hardly breathe as the eldest of the pack representatives, a stern-faced woman named Ivy, who had remained largely silent throughout the earlier proceedings, stepped forward to address the gathering. After careful consideration, Ivy began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. The elders have reached the following judgment. While the bond between King Roran and the outsider known as Alara remains unusual and without clear precedent in recent history, the old texts do confirm that such bonds, though rare, are recognized as legitimate within our traditions, provided the Alpha in question formally and publicly claims the bond before the full assembly of Northern Packs. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd, some murmurs of approval, others of clear disappointment, but Ivy continued before anyone could interrupt. Therefore, she said, the challenge raised by the Eastern Coalition regarding King Roran's legitimacy is dismissed, provided this formal claim occurs within one full turn of the moon. Should King Roran fail to make such a claim, the bond will be considered incomplete, and the question of leadership will be reopened for challenge at that time. Callum's face darkened with barely contained frustration, but he said nothing, clearly understanding that further argument in this moment would only weaken his position further. Roran, for his part, remained still and composed, though Alara caught the slight, relieved exhale he allowed himself once Ivy finished speaking. As the gathering began to disperse, murmurs of conversation filling the hall once more, Roran finally turned to Alara, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and something more uncertain. "We have won ourselves time," he said quietly, drawing her aside from the dispersing crowd. "But the elders have made clear that time is limited. Within 1 month, I must either formally claim this bond before the full assembly, or risk losing everything, including whatever protection this bond currently offers you." Alara felt her heart pounding at the weight of what he was describing. "And what does a formal claim require?" she asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. Roran held her gaze steadily. "It requires that I claim you publicly as my mate, before every pack representative gathered here today," he said. "It is not a decision to be made lightly, Alara, and I would never ask it of you simply to solve a political problem. If we do this, it must be because it is truly what you want, not simply because circumstances have left us little choice." Alara considered his words carefully, thinking back over everything that had happened since the storm first brought that strange fur cloak into her life. From her cautious first conversation with a mysterious stranger in the village square, to the terrifying flight through the forest, to the quiet warmth that had grown steadily between them, despite every reason caution should have kept them apart. "I have spent the last week questioning everything about my life," she said slowly. "Who I am, what this bond means, whether any of this was truly meant to happen, or simply the strange accident of a storm and a lost cloak. But somewhere along the way, questioning turned into something else. I do not want to walk away from this, Roran, not because I am afraid of what happens if I do, but because I do not want to. That has to count for something." Something shifted visibly in Roran's expression at her words, relief, and something warmer, more vulnerable, breaking through the careful composure he had maintained throughout their entire journey together. "Then let us give the elders their formal claim," he said quietly, "when the time is right, not simply because a deadline demands it, but because we both choose it freely." Alara nodded, feeling a quiet certainty settle over her that had been building steadily since that very first evening in the village square, when a stranger's careful questions about a stolen cloak had unknowingly set in motion the most transformative weeks of her entire life. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever doubts remained among the pack elders, or danger still lurked among rival coalitions, she understood now, with complete clarity, that she was ready to face them, not as an accidental outsider caught in wolf-pack politics, but as someone who had chosen this path with open eyes and a steady heart. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation, tension, and quiet, growing closeness between Alara and Roran, as both of them worked to understand not only the responsibilities of the bond they were about to formally claim, but also each other, in ways their hurried, danger-filled first days together had never allowed. Grace remained a steady friend throughout, helping Alara navigate the customs and expectations of Northern Pack life, while Edwin worked tirelessly with Roran to secure the loyalty of wavering Pack representatives before Callum could attempt any further challenge. News arrived twice more of scouts from the Eastern Coalition testing the northern borders, but each time, swift and decisive action from Roran's most trusted Pack members turned the intruders back without serious conflict. A clear demonstration to any watching rivals that the Northern Pack remained strong and united, despite the unusual circumstances surrounding their king's bond. Alara found herself growing more comfortable within the towering stone halls that had once felt so foreign and intimidating, learning names and faces among the Northern Pack members, sharing quiet meals with Grace, and occasionally with Edwin, whose initial caution toward her slowly transformed into genuine respect as he witnessed her handle the pressures of her new position with steady, thoughtful grace. Her relationship with Roran deepened gradually, built not on the dramatic urgency of their first days together, but on quieter moments, shared walks along the mountain paths surrounding the hall, long conversations by the fire about their very different lives before the storm had brought them together, and a growing understanding between them that went far beyond the magical bond that had first connected them. Alara learned that Roran's careful, controlled manner masked a deep sense of responsibility toward his pack, a weight he had carried since inheriting leadership at a young age, following his father's passing. Roran, in turn, discovered in Alara a quiet strength and unshakable honesty that he had rarely encountered among those who typically surrounded him in the Northern Hall, people more often concerned with political advantage than genuine connection. On the evening before the formal ceremony, Alara stood alone on a balcony, overlooking the northern mountains. The fur cloak settled comfortably over her shoulders, as it had been every day since her arrival, watching the last light of sunset paint the peaks in shades of orange and violet. She heard Roran's familiar footsteps approaching before he spoke, and she smiled slightly without turning around. "Nervous?" he asked quietly, coming to stand beside her at the balcony railing. "A little," she admitted. "Tomorrow feels very different from anything I ever imagined for my life, back when my biggest worry was fixing a leaking roof before winter." Roran was quiet for a moment, watching the mountains with her. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked finally, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had rarely heard from him. "If that storm had never happened, if you had never found the cloak, do you think you would have been happier, left alone in your quiet life?" Alara considered the question seriously before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "I would have been safe, comfortable perhaps. But I do not think I would have been as fully alive as I have felt these past weeks, frightening as so much of it has been. I found something in this journey I did not know I was missing, Roran. Not just you, though certainly that too, but a sense of purpose, of mattering to something larger than my own small corner of the world. I do not regret any of it." Roran turned to look at her fully then, something deeply tender in his expression that she had come to recognize over their weeks together, an openness he rarely showed to anyone beyond her. "I feel the same," he said quietly. "I have led this pack with discipline and duty for years, believing that was enough. That connection and warmth were luxuries an alpha could not afford to prioritize. You have shown me how wrong that belief was." The following morning arrived clear and bright, the entire Northern Hall alive with preparation for the formal ceremony that would take place before the full assembly of pack representatives once more gathered from across the northern and neighboring territories. Alara dressed carefully with Grace's help, the fur cloak, cleaned and restored to its full former glory, settled properly over her shoulders, as the symbol it had always been meant to be, no longer an accidental discovery from a desperate winter storm, but a rightful claim she now understood and embraced fully. The great hall filled once more with representatives from every corner of the northern territories, along with a small but notable number from neighboring packs who had come to witness whether the unusual bond between their alpha king and an ordinary seamstress would truly be formalized before them all. Callum stood among the gathered crowd, his expression carefully neutral, clearly recognizing that any further challenge now would only diminish his own standing further. Roran stood at the center of the hall, dressed in the formal attire of northern leadership, and as Alara walked forward to join him, the entire assembly falling silent at her approach, she felt none of the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her during their first tense encounter in the village square so many weeks earlier. Instead, She felt only a quiet, steady certainty that carried her forward with confident, measured steps. Before this assembly, and before the old magic that first bound us together, Roran said, his voice carrying clearly and powerfully through the silent hall, I formally claim Alara as my mate, not because ancient magic demanded it, and not because political necessity required it, but because I have come to understand, through every trial these past weeks have brought us, that she is exactly who I choose to stand beside for the rest of my life. Alara felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes as she met his gaze, the weight of the moment settling over her with a warmth that overwhelmed every lingering doubt she had carried. And I accept this bond freely, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. Not as an accident of a storm and a lost cloak, but as a choice I make with complete certainty, standing here today. A murmur of approval swept through much of the gathered assembly, and even among those who had harbored doubts, the sincerity and strength in both their voices seemed to settle whatever remaining uncertainty lingered in the hall. Ivy, the elder who had delivered the earlier judgment, stepped forward one final time to formally recognize the bond before the full assembly, declaring the challenge to Roran's leadership permanently resolved, and the northern bloodline's strength reaffirmed through this unprecedented but now fully legitimate union. As the ceremony concluded and the hall erupted into a mixture of formal acknowledgement and genuine celebration among those who had come to respect the courage both Roran and Alara had shown throughout the entire ordeal, Alara found herself standing beside the man who had once tracked his own lost scent across half the country, now bound to her not by accident, but by a choice both of them had made freely, with open eyes and steady hearts. The fur cloak that had once seemed like nothing more than a lucky find in a desperate winter storm now rested easily on her shoulders, no longer a mystery to be solved, or a danger to be feared, but simply, finally, a symbol of exactly where she belonged.